The secret gay beach orgies the British establishment tried to erase. One accusation shattered Baron Edward Montagu's reputation. But he didn't disappear into disgrace. He weaponized his criminal conviction and sparked a historic gay liberation movement. His fall was catastrophic because he started at the absolute peak. Born in 1926, Edward inherited a life dictated by aristocratic rules, absolute privilege in exchange for absolute conformity. At age 2, his father died. Edward inherited the title of 3rd Baron Montagu and Beaulieu, a 7,000-acre estate in Hampshire featuring a 13th-century abbey, ancient woodlands, and miles of private coastline. He controlled a modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds before he could even speak. The establishment mapped out his life: Eton, the military, the House of Lords, a wife and an heir. He played the part perfectly. He served as a lieutenant in the elite Grenadier Guards, and at 21, took his seat as the youngest member of the House of Lords. He was the nation's golden boy. But behind the tailored suits and exclusive clubs, Edward hid a reality that the British state classified as a severe criminal offense. The Britain of the late 1940s and early 1950s was a place of deep contradiction. It was a nation recovering from the devastation of war, clinging fiercely to traditional morality as a bulwark against rapid global change. The law, unrevised since the Victorian era, dictated that any homosexual act between men was a crime of gross indecency, punishable by years of hard labor or even life imprisonment. But the legal threat was only half the danger. The onset of the Cold War had bred a toxic national paranoia. The government and the press relentlessly pushed the narrative that homosexual men were weak, easily compromised, and prime targets for Soviet blackmail. To be gay in this era was to be viewed simultaneously as a moral sickness and a direct threat to national security. Against this suffocating backdrop, Edward Montagu, who would later identify as bisexual, found himself trapped. The society that worshipped his title demanded the suppression of his desires. The pressure to maintain the facade of the perfect aristocratic heir was immense, a constant silent suffocation. Unable to breathe within the confines of his predetermined life, he sought an escape. His escape lay far beyond the polished drawing rooms of London, buried deep within a dangerous underground. Alongside friends like Michael Pitt Rivers, a wealthy landowner, and Peter Wildblood, a distinguished diplomatic correspondent for the Daily Mail, Edward navigated a dual existence. What made his particular rebellion so perilous was his attraction to what was bluntly termed rough trade. His desires completely bypassed the discreet encounters of his own class, gravitating fiercely toward working-class men, particularly young servicemen in uniform. This was a profound transgression, crossing both the lethal lines of sexual morality and the rigid, unspoken boundaries of the British class system. Driven perhaps by the arrogance of untouchable wealth, Edward believed his title provided an impenetrable shield. He assumed that the rules governing ordinary men did not apply to a baron within the walls of his own domain. This fatal hubris manifested physically at his estate, leading to a series of reckless decisions that would soon collide with a state machinery desperate for a scapegoat. The government, spearheaded by the notoriously homophobic Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe, had launched a targeted crusade to cleanse the nation. They needed a high-profile target to strike fear into the underground networks. Lord Montagu of Beaulieu was the perfect prey. The reality of Edward Montagu's existence in the early 1950s was defined by a brutal, exhausting duality. To the public eye, he was the flawless embodiment of the British aristocracy navigating the post-war world. He spent his days managing the sprawling, complex machinery of the Beaulieu estate. He walked the ancient grounds shadowed by the ruins of the 13th century Cistercian abbey that his ancestors had claimed centuries before. He sat in the heavy, oak-paneled rooms of Palace House, making decisions about tenant farmers, land management, and the preservation of a legacy that felt heavier with each passing year. He took his inherited seat in the House of Lords, rubbing shoulders with the men who dictated the moral and legal framework of the British Empire. He was expected to be a pillar of stability in a nation still scarred by the Blitz and exhausted by rationing. He was the perfect, polished surface. Beneath that surface, an entirely different existence was taking shape, driven by an intense criminalized need for genuine connection. The laws of the time did not merely discourage his sexuality, they actively hunted it. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885, the same legislation that had destroyed Oscar Wilde decades earlier, remained in full devastating effect. It criminalized any act of gross indecency between men, a term so legally vague that it could encompass almost any form of physical intimacy, whether in public or behind the locked doors of a private bedroom. The penalty was severe, but the social execution that accompanied a conviction was absolute. To be exposed was to lose everything: family, property, career, and basic human dignity. This legal terror was magnified tenfold by the political climate of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, a virulent moral panic had gripped the British establishment. The defection of diplomats Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean to the Soviet Union in 1951 had sent shockwaves through the government. Because Burgess and Maclean were part of a known homosexual network within the upper classes, the intelligence services and the government drew a terrifying immediate conclusion: homosexuality was a fatal security flaw. Gay men were viewed as inherently unstable, easily blackmailed by Soviet agents, and therefore enemies of the state. Sir John Knott Bauer, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, openly swore to eradicate homosexual behavior in London, specifically targeting the wealthy and influential men who believed their status protected them. Under the direction of the fiercely conservative Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe, the police were given unprecedented latitude to infiltrate, surveil, and dismantle gay networks. The state was not just enforcing a law, it was prosecuting a crusade. Edward navigated this minefield with a perilous combination of necessity and aristocratic arrogance. He found his solace in the hidden, subterranean networks of London. It was a world of coded language, secret glances in dimly lit pubs, and private, heavily guarded gatherings. In this shadow society, he formed crucial bonds with men who shared his burden. The most significant of these were Michael Pitt Rivers and Peter Wildeblood. Pitt Rivers was a man of similar background, a wealthy landowner who understood the suffocating weight of inheritance and societal expectation. Peter Wildeblood, however, offered a different perspective. As the diplomatic correspondent for the Daily Mail, Wildeblood was deeply entrenched in the very establishment that sought to destroy them. He was brilliant, observant, and acutely aware of the political machinery moving against them. Together, they formed a tight, loyal circle, a buffer against a world that wanted them imprisoned. Yet Edward's desires pushed him beyond the relatively safe confines of aristocratic discretion. He was not drawn to the refined, often artificial men of his own social standing. His attraction was squarely focused on what was dismissively referred to by the upper classes as rough trade. He sought the company of working-class men, particularly those serving in the military. There was a profound, complex psychology behind this specific desire. The young Royal Air Force servicemen and soldiers represented everything the aristocracy was not: unpretentious, straightforward, and rooted in a raw physical reality. For Edward, who had spent his life trapped in a gilded cage of manners, protocol, and endless unspoken rules, the blunt honesty and unpolished masculinity of these men offered an intoxicating escape. It was a complete rejection of the world he was forced to inhabit. However, this choice carried catastrophic risks. Engaging with working-class men, especially military personnel, shattered the rigid class barriers that defined British society. It introduced an unpredictable element into his secret life. These men were entirely outside his sphere of influence. They did not play by the rules of the upper class, and they were far more vulnerable to police intimidation. But Edward, insulated by a lifetime of untouchable privilege, failed to recognize the true depth of the danger. He believed that the walls of Beaulieu were thicker than the laws of the land. This fatal miscalculation led to the establishment of the beach hut gatherings. The physical location of these events was deeply symbolic. The hut was situated on a remote, isolated stretch of his private coastline along the Solent, miles away from the imposing, watchful structure of Palace House. It was a rudimentary wooden structure, entirely lacking the luxury and pretension of his daily life. By bringing the hidden world of London to this isolated corner of his ancestral estate, Edward was making a profound statement of ownership and defiance. This was his land, and upon it, he would dictate the rules. The weekend gatherings at the beach hut were a stark contrast to the formal dinners and societal obligations he endured during the week. Edward used his immense wealth to fund these escapes, paying for the travel and accommodation of the young RAF servicemen he and his friends had met in London. In August 1953, the authorities made their first direct strike against the Baron. Edward Montagu was charged under the era's strict moral laws regarding an incident with a local scout acting as a guide at the Beaulieu estate. For a member of the House of Lords to face such allegations was a scandal of unimaginable proportions. The state threw its resources into securing a conviction, eager to make a swift example of him. The ensuing trial was a grueling ordeal, tearing away the first layers of Edward's protected public image. He was forced to stand in the dock, defending himself against accusations that shocked the nation. However, the evidence was not as ironclad as the prosecution had hoped. The jury deliberated, but could not reach a consensus, resulting in an open verdict. Edward walked out of the courtroom, legally free, yet his reputation had sustained massive damage, and public doubt was permanently planted. A rational man, having just narrowly escaped total ruin, would have severed all ties with the underground world to adopt a life of invisible compliance. Edward, however, was blinded by a mixture of aristocratic pride and a deep, unyielding need for human connection. He interpreted the open verdict as proof of his invincibility, completely ignoring it as a final warning. Returning to his estate, he astonishingly resumed his secret gatherings. He continued to invite friends like Michael Pitt Rivers and Peter Wildblood, along with working-class servicemen, into his private sanctuary. Inside the cramped, isolated walls of the beach hut, the strict hierarchy of 1950s, Britain was abandoned. A baron, a wealthy landowner, a prominent journalist, and private soldiers drank together, laughed together, and pursued forbidden connections. Photographs were taken, capturing moments of hidden joy. Letters were exchanged, filled with expressions of affection that, in this specific time and place, amounted to signed confessions of a felony. Edward maintained until the end of his life that every interaction was entirely consensual. Still, the inherent imbalance of power cannot be ignored. The young servicemen, earning meager military wages, were suddenly thrust into a world of limitless wealth. The dazzle of a baron's favor and the escape from military discipline created an environment where the lines of pure consent were inevitably blurred by class disparity. This decision to continue the gatherings was a fatal miscalculation. The Home Office, stung by their failure to secure a conviction in the earlier trial, was furious. Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe doubled down on his crusade. Edward Montagu was no longer just a target. He became an obsession for the British police force. The operation shifted to a coordinated national intelligence effort. Authorities intercepted mail, monitored telephone calls, and trailed vehicles across London and Hampshire. Their ultimate goal extended beyond catching individuals. They aimed to dismantle the entire network. The local police, aware of the unusual traffic heading towards the remote Beaulieu coastline, also took notice. Whispers among tenant farmers turned into formal reports. The shield of aristocratic invulnerability was fracturing. Edward continued to invite danger into his home, unaware that the government was actively building a powder keg beneath him, needing only a single spark to shatter his world completely. The authorities were building a case of conspiracy, a charge that carried much heavier penalties and allowed for a wider net to be cast. The breaking point came when the police focused their attention on the most vulnerable members of Edward's circle, the young Royal Air Force servicemen. Edward McNally and John Reynolds were ordinary men caught in an extraordinary trap. They lacked the wealth, the titles, and the powerful connections of the aristocrats they had partied with. The police recognized this vulnerability immediately and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The state machinery prepared to crush them in order to reach the Baron. Detectives cornered the young airmen and subjected them to terrifying interrogations. They were stripped of their military dignity and faced with the absolute destruction of their lives. The police explicitly threatened them with long prison sentences, dishonorable discharges, and public ruin. The message was clear: confess and implicate Lord Montagu, or bear the full devastating weight of the law alone. It was a brutal form of state-sponsored blackmail, designed to break their spirits. Faced with the terrifying prospect of hard labor and social annihilation, the airmen broke. They provided the police with detailed written confessions, outlining the events that took place at the Beaulieu beach hut. They named Edward Montagu, Michael Pitt Rivers, and Peter Wildblood. More crucially, they handed over physical evidence. Intimate, passionate letters exchanged between the men were surrendered to the authorities. These private words of affection were about to be weaponized in the most public way imaginable. Armed with these coerced confessions and stolen letters, the state moved with swift, overwhelming force. In January 1954, they launched a coordinated series of raids. Police officers descended on Beaulieu without valid search warrants, forcing their way into Palace House. They ransacked the historic rooms, tearing through Edward's private belongings, diaries, and correspondence. The sanctity of his ancestral home was violated by men determined to unearth his deepest secrets. He was entirely exposed. Simultaneously, police raided the London homes of Michael Pitt Rivers and Peter Wildeblood. The coordinated nature of these strikes revealed the true scale of the government's operation. This was not a standard police investigation. It was a military-style offensive against British citizens. The three men were arrested and formally charged with conspiracy to incite others to commit gross indecency. The trap had slammed shut. The safety of the beach hut was replaced by the cold reality of a jail cell. The arrest sent a shock wave of terror through the entire gay community in Britain. If a baron, a wealthy landowner, and a prominent journalist could be dragged from their homes and treated like dangerous criminals, absolutely no one was safe. The government had successfully created the climate of intense fear they desired. Men across the country burned their letters, destroyed their photographs, and severed ties with their friends. The state had effectively declared war on a segment of its own population. Edward found himself stripped of all his inherited power. His title meant nothing to the detectives processing his arrest. His wealth could not buy his way out of the holding cell. The very society that had bowed to him mere months ago was now preparing to eagerly consume his downfall. The British press, always hungry for a scandal, began sharpening their knives. The stage was set for one of the most sensational and destructive trials of the 20th century. As he awaited trial, the sheer weight of the betrayal and the state's cruelty pressed down on him. The letters he had written in moments of vulnerability, believing them to be safe, were now in the hands of his enemies. The young men he had invited into his home had been twisted into weapons against him. The profound isolation he felt was absolute. He was a lord of the realm, yet he had never been more powerless in his entire life. The government's handling of the evidence was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They deliberately leaked fragments of information to the press to ensure the public was primed for a spectacle. The newspapers printed sensationalized accounts of aristocratic depravity, carefully omitting the coercion used to obtain the testimonies. Edward Montagu was convicted in the court of public opinion long before he ever stepped foot in the Winchester assizes. The state made sure his reputation was destroyed first. For Peter Wildeblood, the arrest was a harsh collision of his two worlds. As a journalist, he knew exactly how the media machine operated, and he knew it was now turned against him. He watched his own colleagues at the Daily Mail prepare to butcher his character in print. The hypocrisy of the establishment was laid bare. Men he had dined with and worked alongside were now pretending they never knew him, terrified of being guilty by association. Michael Pitt Rivers, a man accustomed to the quiet administration of his rural estates, found himself thrust into a glaring, unforgiving spotlight. His wealth and land, usually symbols of stability, offered no protection against the Home Office's moral crusade. The three friends, once bound by shared secrets and private rebellion, were now bound by a shared nightmare. They were facing a judicial system that viewed their very existence as an infection that needed to be ruthlessly excised. The legal defense teams faced an impossible task. They were not just fighting the specific charges of conspiracy. They were fighting the entire political weight of the British government. The prosecutors had unlimited resources and a mandate from the highest levels of power to secure convictions at any cost. Edward's lawyers advised him of the grim reality. The evidence, tainted as it was by blackmail and illegal searches, would likely be admitted by a hostile judge. The pressure to plead guilty and quietly accept their fate was immense. The authorities offered subtle hints of leniency if they saved the state the embarrassment of a drawn-out public trial. Many men in their position would have surrendered, hoping to minimize the damage and disappear into obscurity. But a profound sense of injustice began to harden within the three defendants. They had been hunted, surveilled, and violated. A quiet surrender felt like a final betrayal of themselves. As the date for the trial at the Winchester Assizes approached, the atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating. Edward walked the grounds of Beaulieu one last time as a free man, fully aware that he might not see his ancestral home again for years. The massive stone walls of the abbey ruins offered a stark reminder of how quickly powerful institutions could fall and be reduced to rubble. He was about to face a similar, orchestrated destruction of his own life. The physical structure of the Winchester Assizes loomed like a fortress of absolute moral authority. As March 1954 arrived, this historic courthouse in Hampshire became the epicenter of the British establishment's war on its own citizens. It was a building designed to intimidate, all heavy stone and dark wood, a physical manifestation of a justice system that had already decided the guilt of the men about to walk through its doors. Edward Montagu, Michael Pitt Rivers, and Peter Wildeblood did not arrive as presumed innocent individuals. They arrived as the state's chosen sacrifices, brought forward to appease a manufactured national panic. The media circus surrounding the courthouse was unprecedented in its scale and ferocity. Reporters and photographers from every major national and international newspaper camped out on the pavement. Flashbulbs exploded like artillery fire every time a vehicle approached the court steps. The press had been carefully fed a diet of sensational rumors by the police in the weeks leading up to the trial. They were not there to report on a legal proceeding. They were there to document a public execution of character. The crowd that gathered outside was a volatile mix of the curious, the outraged, and the deeply hostile. Stepping into the courtroom, Edward faced a sea of faces that represented the very society he had been born to lead. The galleries were packed with onlookers, some of whom he recognized from the drawing rooms of London. They had come to watch the Lord of Beaulieu be dismantled piece by piece. The judge presided over the room with a cold, unforgiving demeanor. The prosecution team, led by some of the most ruthless legal minds the government could assemble, laid out their case with a chilling surgical precision. They painted the three defendants not as men seeking connection, but as predatory monsters who had utilized their wealth to corrupt the youth of the armed forces. The foundation of the prosecution's case rested entirely on the evidence stolen during the illegal raids and the testimonies extracted through coercion. The prosecution began by reading the confiscated letters aloud to the packed courtroom. These were documents of profound private vulnerability. They contained words of affection, longing, and intimacy exchanged in the strict confidence of the beach hut. Hearing these deeply personal sentiments read in the dry, sneering tone of a government prosecutor was a form of psychological torture. Every word was twisted to sound like the machinations of a criminal conspiracy. Edward sat completely still in the dock as his private life was laid bare before the nation. The prosecution deliberately chose the most passionate phrases, stripping them of all human context and presenting them as clinical evidence of gross indecency. The strategy was clear. If they could make the jury feel enough disgust, the legality of how the letters were obtained would be ignored. The defense attorneys fought bitterly to have the letters excluded, pointing out the lack of warrants and the violation of basic privacy. But the judge, acting as an extension of the government's will, allowed the letters to remain. The atmosphere in the courtroom reached a breaking point when the prosecution called their star witnesses to the stand. Edward McNally and John Reynolds, the young RAF servicemen who had been guests at Beaulieu, walked into the room. They looked pale, exhausted, and deeply terrified. The men in the dock locked eyes with the young soldiers, they had once hosted and befriended. There was no hatred in Edward's gaze, only a profound, tragic understanding of the brutal pressure these men were under. The police had given them a stark choice: testify or be destroyed. They had chosen survival. Under the guidance of the prosecution, McNally and Reynolds recited the stories the police had hammered into them. They detailed the weekend parties, the flow of alcohol, and the sexual encounters. But their voices lacked conviction. They spoke like men reading from a script they did not fully understand. The defense cross-examined them fiercely, forcing them to admit the terrifying threats the police had leveled against them. They confessed to the courtroom that they had been promised complete immunity in exchange for turning state's evidence. The extortion at the heart of the government's case was dragged into the light. The exposure of the police blackmail made the jury visibly uncomfortable. The narrative of the wealthy predators corrupting innocent soldiers began to fracture. It became obvious that the state was willing to engage in criminal behavior itself to secure a conviction. However, the prosecution quickly pivoted, reminding the jury of the letters and the overarching moral panic of the Cold War. They leaned heavily on the ingrained prejudice of the era, arguing that, regardless of the police methods, the men in the dock were a spreading infection that had to be contained. It was during the defense's presentation that the trial took a turn that no one, not even the government, had anticipated. Peter Wildeblood took the witness stand. As a seasoned journalist, he understood the power of the narrative. He knew that the state expected him to cower, to beg for mercy, or to lie and deny everything in a desperate bid for freedom. He refused to give them the satisfaction. With a calm, clear voice that carried across the hushed courtroom, Peter Wildeblood looked directly at the judge and the jury and told the absolute truth. He stated without a trace of shame or hesitation that he was a homosexual. The admission sent a physical shockwave through the room. In 1954, men simply did not say those words in public, let alone in a court of law while facing a prison sentence. Wildeblood dismantled the prosecution's narrative of sickness and perversion. He explained that his sexuality was not a choice, nor was it a disease to be cured by imprisonment. He spoke of the deep, enduring love he was capable of feeling, completely humanizing an identity the state was desperately trying to demonize. Wildeblood's testimony was a masterstroke of defiance. He turned the spotlight away from the alleged crimes of the defendants and focused it squarely on the cruelty of the law itself. He highlighted the hypocrisy of a society that forced millions of men to live in terror and shadows. He pointed out the horrific damage caused by the police methods, the blackmail, and the ruined lives of the servicemen caught in the crossfire. For the first time in British legal history, a gay man stood up in open court and demanded to be recognized as a human being, not a statistic of moral decay. His bravery, however, could not dismantle the rigid machinery of 1950s justice. The judge's final summing up to the jury was dripping with hostility. He instructed them to ignore the defense's arguments about police coercion and to focus entirely on the moral revulsion of the acts described. He framed the defendants as a danger to the very fabric of British society. The jury retreated to deliberate, leaving Edward, Michael, and Peter in a state of agonizing suspense. The 8-day ordeal had exhausted them completely. They had fought back with everything they had, but the weight of the establishment was overwhelming. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell entirely silent. The foreman stood up and delivered the verdict the government had demanded: guilty. All 3 men were found guilty of conspiracy to incite gross indecency. The prosecution had won their prize. The judge did not hesitate in handing down the sentences. He addressed the men with utter contempt, stating that their social standing made their crimes even more unforgivable. Michael Pitt Rivers and Peter Wildblood were sentenced to 18 months in prison. Edward Montagu, the third Baron of Beaulieu, was sentenced to 12 months. The transition was brutal and immediate. There was no time to process the destruction of their lives. Police officers stepped into the dock, placed their hands on the defendants, and led them away from the public gaze. Edward was stripped of his tailored suit, his title, and his freedom in a matter of hours. He was transported away from the historic architecture of Winchester and thrust into the cold, violent reality of the British penal system. The golden boy of the aristocracy was now simply another number in a concrete cell. The iron doors of Her Majesty's prison Pentonville did not distinguish between a common thief and a baron of the realm. When Edward Montagu stepped across that threshold, the physical reality of his sentence crushed whatever remained of his aristocratic isolation. He was stripped of his bespoke clothing, his name replaced by a sterile sequence of numbers, and thrust into an environment of deliberate, mechanical brutality. The scent of ancient stone, carbolic soap, and confined humanity replaced the fresh sea air of his Hampshire estate. For a man who had spent his entire life commanding vast spaces and deferential staff, the sudden confinement within a tiny, poorly lit cell was a psychological shock designed to break the mind as much as the body. He was subjected to the grueling routine of 1950s penal labor, sewing mailbags until his hands blistered, eating meager rations in absolute silence, and enduring the underlying threat of violence that permeates any prison ecosystem. Yet the government's calculated plan to destroy him through sheer humiliation began to backfire almost immediately. The architect of this witch hunt, Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe, had severely miscalculated the temper of the British public. The trial at Winchester was intended to be a masterclass in moral hygiene, a public execution that would solidify the state's absolute authority over the private lives of its citizens. Instead, the relentless, sensationalized media coverage exposed the grotesque machinery of state-sponsored blackmail. Ordinary citizens, many of whom harbored deep conservative prejudices against homosexuality, found themselves repulsed not by the defendants, but by the police. The revelation that detectives had terrorized young servicemen, threatening them with ruin unless they provided scripted testimonies and surrendered private letters, struck a nerve. The British public possessed a deep-seated aversion to the tactics of the police state, a fresh memory of the authoritarian regimes they had just defeated in the Second World War. Watching their own government employ extortion and illegal raids to crush a handful of men felt dangerously un-British. This wave of public unease transformed into a tangible political crisis. The establishment newspapers that had initially bayed for Edward's blood began to publish editorials questioning the proportionality and basic fairness of the law. The sheer spectacle of dragging a lord, a prominent landowner, and a respected journalist through the mud for private consensual acts highlighted the absurdity of the Victorian statutes. The legal framework that mandated such destructive prosecutions was suddenly under severe scrutiny. The government, realizing that their grand moral crusade had instead sparked a backlash against their own authoritarian overreach, was forced to retreat. In a direct, undeniable response to the outrage generated by the Beaulieu trial, the conservative government appointed a departmental committee to thoroughly review the laws concerning homosexual offenses. This body, chaired by Sir John Wolfenden, was born directly from the ashes of Edward Montagu's public ruin. While politicians in London debated the philosophical boundaries of state interference, Edward survived his sentence through a quiet, unyielding endurance. He was transferred to Wormwood Scrubs, another imposing Victorian fortress, where he continued to serve his time with a stoicism that confounded his jailers. Refusing to beg for clemency or offer groveling apologies to the press, he endured the system that sought to erase him, holding on to the undeniable fact that he still owned the Beaulieu estate. His land, the ancient inheritance that the government had raided but could not legally confiscate, became his anchor. He planned his return not as a broken exile, but as a man determined to outlive his own disgrace. When the heavy prison gates finally opened in 1955, Edward emerged into a world that had irrevocably changed. The stigma of a prison sentence was a heavy cloak, and many expected him to flee to the continent, to live out his days in quiet, wealthy obscurity in France or Italy, as many disgraced aristocrats had done before him. He defied them all. He traveled straight back to Hampshire, back to the massive gates of Palace House. The local villagers, the tenant farmers, and the staff who had witnessed the terrifying police raids were waiting for him. They did not shun him. They welcomed their lord back. Edward immediately channeled his defiance into a massive transformative project. He recognized that the old aristocratic model of relying purely on agricultural rents was dying, and his massive legal fees required an aggressive financial strategy. He threw the doors of Palace House open to the paying public, pioneering the concept of the modern stately home attraction. He took his lifelong passion for vintage automobiles and expanded it into the National Motor Museum, situated right on the grounds of his estate. He worked relentlessly, turning the site of his deepest humiliation into one of the most successful and beloved tourist destinations in the United Kingdom. He forced the public to come to him, to walk his lands, and to acknowledge his continued existence. It was a brilliant, highly visible act of survival. His co-defendants fought equally vital battles. Peter Wildeblood, the brilliant journalist, who had shocked the courtroom by openly declaring his homosexuality, refused to be silenced by his prison sentence. Upon his release, he wrote a blistering, profoundly influential book titled Against the Law. It was a forensic dismantling of the British justice system, detailing the horrific conditions of the prisons and the soul-crushing reality of living as a criminalized minority. The book became a sensation, reaching thousands of households and humanizing the gay experience in a way that had never been achieved before in British literature. Wildeblood became the first man in the UK to publicly and unapologetically campaign for gay rights, a direct consequence of the trial that was supposed to destroy him. Michael Pitt Rivers, too, returned to his estate, choosing a life of quiet dignity, refusing to let the state's judgment dictate his worth. The seeds planted by their suffering finally broke the surface in 1957 with the publication of the Wolfenden Report. The committee, heavily influenced by the public reaction to the Beaulieu scandal and the compelling arguments of men like Wildeblood, delivered a staggering conclusion. They recommended that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be considered a criminal offense. They drew a firm line between private morality and public law, stating categorically that it was not the government's business to police the bedrooms of its citizens. The establishment was shocked. The report was a direct repudiation of the aggressive persecutory tactics employed by the Home Office just 3 years earlier. It took a decade of fierce political battling, but in 1967 the Sexual Offences Act was passed, finally decriminalizing homosexuality in England and Wales. The law that had broken Oscar Wilde, the law that had driven Alan Turing to despair, and the law that had imprisoned Edward Montagu was finally dismantled. Edward lived to see this monumental shift. Though he rarely claimed direct credit for the revolution he had inadvertently sparked, he focused on his family and his estate. In 1958, he married Elizabeth Varley, ensuring the continuation of his lineage with the birth of a son and a daughter. Following their divorce, he married Fiona Herbert in 1974, having another son. He became a fixture of the British heritage industry, a respected elder statesman who had navigated the darkest corners of state persecution and emerged victorious simply by refusing to be destroyed. The rustic wooden beach hut on the Beaulieu coastline, the site of the secret gatherings that had ignited the entire scandal, was eventually demolished, but the physical destruction of the hut was irrelevant. The true legacy of that isolated stretch of sand was already cemented in the statute books of the nation. In 2007, entering the final years of his life, Edward finally felt secure enough to speak his complete truth to the world, formally confirming his bisexuality. It was the final quiet closure to a lifetime of forced duality. When he died peacefully in 2015, at the age of 88, he died not as a convicted felon or a disgraced outcast, but as a beloved patriarch and a quiet pioneer. The government had thrown the full, terrifying weight of its power at him, seeking to make him a permanent symbol of moral decay. Instead, through his sheer stubborn refusal to be erased, Edward John Barrington Douglas Scott Montagu became the catalyst for one of the most profound civil rights victories in modern British history. The golden cage had been shattered, the witch hunt had failed, and the man they tried to bury had instead planted the roots of a freer world. History is rarely shaped by flawless individuals acting with perfect foresight. It is often forged in the fires of personal disaster, driven by flawed humans who simply refuse to surrender when the machinery of the world turns against them. The story of the Beaulieu scandal is a stark reminder of the devastating speed with which a society can turn on its own citizens, weaponizing morality to justify cruelty, blackmail, and the destruction of the private sphere. The men who orchestrated the persecution of Lord Montagu believed they were protecting the fabric of the nation. In reality, they were exposing its deepest rot, demonstrating that any law requiring extortion and the theft of love letters to enforce is fundamentally illegitimate. Edward Montagu did not ask to be a martyr. He was a man of immense privilege who sought human connection in a world that criminalized his very nature. But when the state dragged him into the unforgiving light of the courtroom, attempting to use his ruin as a weapon of mass intimidation, he inadvertently became a mirror. The public looked into that mirror and saw the ugly, violent reality of their own laws. The legacy of the beach hut is not one of scandal, but of resilience. It teaches us that true societal change often begins in the moments of deepest humiliation, when those deemed entirely powerless realize that simply surviving the fire is the ultimate act of defiance. The world that condemned him is gone, swept away by the very tide of progress his suffering helped to unleash, leaving behind a legacy of hard-won liberty that continues to protect millions today.